Imagine for a moment that you weren't born now. Imagine you opened your eyes for the first time in the year 1850 in Victorian England, and you were told before you could even speak, before you could even choose anything for yourself, that your entire life had already been decided. In this video, we're stepping into that life. We'll walk through what it actually meant to be born a woman during one of the most restrictive periods in modern history, from the moment of birth, through childhood, marriage, motherhood, and old age. Some of what you're about to hear will sound almost unbelievable by today's standards, but every single detail in this video is historically documented. Let's step back in time. The moment you're born, your fate is already shifting depending on one simple fact: your sex. If you're a boy, there's celebration, an heir, a future provider. If you're a girl, the mood in the room is quieter. Not because you're unwanted necessarily, but because everyone in that room already knows the road ahead of you is going to be narrower, harder to control, and largely decided by other people. As a young girl, you're taught early that your value lies primarily in two things: your appearance and your future usefulness as a wife. While your brothers are sent off to proper schools to learn mathematics, science, literature, and law, your education, if you receive one at all, focuses on needlework, music, drawing, and just enough reading to manage a household later in life. Deep academic learning is considered not just unnecessary for you, it's often considered actively dangerous. Doctors and scholars of the time genuinely argue that too much intellectual effort could damage a woman's reproductive organs, weaken her mind, or make her unfit for marriage. Your curiosity, if you have it, learns very quickly to stay quiet. By your early teenage years, your entire identity is already being shaped around one single future goal: marriage. Not marriage as a personal choice built on love, though that occasionally happens, but marriage as a transaction, arranged and negotiated largely by your father, sometimes without much consideration for what you actually want. Your worth in this transaction is measured by your reputation, your obedience, your appearance, and often, quite plainly, by the size of the dowry your family can offer. Once you do marry, something remarkable happens under the law. Something that would sound almost like fiction if it weren't so well documented. Under a legal principle called coverture, your individual legal identity essentially disappears. You and your husband become, in the eyes of the law, one single legal person, and that person is him. Any money you earn belongs to him. Any property you brought into the marriage belongs to him. Even your own body, in the eyes of the law, is largely under his authority. You cannot sign contracts independently. You cannot sue someone or be sued without your husband's involvement. If you have children and the marriage ends, custody almost always defaults to your husband, regardless of who was the more present, caring parent. If your husband turns out to be cruel, controlling, or even violent, your legal options are extremely limited. Divorce, where it exists at all, is difficult, expensive, and heavily stacked against you. In many cases, a husband simply needs to prove infidelity to obtain a divorce. A wife, on the other hand, often has to prove infidelity combined with additional serious offenses like extreme cruelty or abandonment just to be granted the same right. Society, meanwhile, tends to view a woman seeking divorce with deep suspicion, regardless of the reason behind it. Now let's talk about your body, because even that isn't entirely considered your own domain of authority. If you show signs of anxiety, sadness, frustration, or simply a strong personality that doesn't fit neatly into the era's expectations, doctors may diagnose you with something called hysteria, a vague, catch-all medical label used almost exclusively on women. Treatments range from complete bed rest and isolation from stimulating conversation to invasive medical procedures to being permanently placed in an asylum by your husband or father, sometimes for nothing more than being seen as too outspoken, too emotional, or too difficult to control. Let's talk about work, assuming you're not from a wealthy family and actually need to earn money. Your job options are extremely limited compared to men, and the pay for equivalent labor is dramatically lower. You might work as a domestic servant, a seamstress, a laundress, or in a textile factory under grueling, often unsafe conditions. Professional fields like medicine, law, and higher academia are almost entirely closed to you, not because of any lack of ability, but purely because of your sex. If you do manage to somehow gain access to a profession, you're often paid a fraction of what a man doing identical work would earn, and any wages you do collect, once married, legally belong to your husband anyway. And when it comes to actual political power, your voice quite literally doesn't count. You cannot vote. You cannot run for office. Every single law that governs your life, your marriage, your property, your body, your children, is written and voted on entirely by men. You live your entire life under rules you had absolutely no part in creating. Even your clothing reflects this control. Tight corsets, heavy layered skirts, and restrictive fashion aren't just style choices, they're physical embodiments of the era's expectations, controlled, restrained, decorative, and not built for physical freedom or movement. Meanwhile, respectable women are expected to remain largely within domestic and social spaces considered appropriate for their gender, while unaccompanied travel or independent public presence can damage a woman's reputation entirely, sometimes permanently. Now, despite everything we've just described, it's important to say this clearly. Women were never passive throughout this entire period. Quietly, and then increasingly loudly, resistance was already building. Women began forming reading groups, then advocacy circles, then full organized movements. Figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in the United States and Emmeline Pankhurst in Britain began organizing, writing, protesting, and demanding legal recognition as full citizens rather than legal extensions of their husbands or fathers. Progress was slow, and it came at a real personal cost for many of these women, including arrest, public humiliation, and social exile. But that resistance is exactly why the story doesn't end where it started. Over the following decades, laws slowly began to shift. Property rights expanded. Divorce laws slowly became somewhat fairer. Educational access gradually widened. And eventually, after generations of sustained pressure, women secured the right to vote, first in some countries, then gradually across much of the world. None of this happened quickly, and none of it happened without enormous personal sacrifice from women who were told, repeatedly, that their demands were unreasonable, dangerous, or simply impossible. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If you had been born into that exact life, with that exact set of legal restrictions, social expectations, and closed doors, how differently would your entire existence have unfolded? What parts of your current life, your education, your career, your ability to vote, marry who you choose, or simply exist as your own legal person, would have been completely off the table? History like this isn't meant to simply shock you. It's meant to show you exactly how far certain rights had to travel to exist at all, and to remind you that many of the freedoms we now consider basic, unquestionable facts of life were, not that long ago, considered radical, dangerous, or entirely impossible. If this video gave you a new perspective, let me know in the comments what surprised you the most. And if you'd like to see this same concept explored through a completely different historical period or culture, tell me below, because history has no shortage of stories worth remembering. I'll see you in the next video.